My father, General Marcus Thorne, stood before my entire command at White Sands and pointed a finger at my chest. He wasn't speaking to me, he was sentencing me. "Who allowed this failure in here?" he roared, and the world shattered. He thought his power could erase my existence. He didn't know. The silence he created was the blueprint for his own destruction. My name is Major Eliza Keaton. I'm 37 years old. The heavy steel door to the Strategic Operations Center, the war room, hissed shut behind me, sealing me inside with the silence. It wasn't an empty silence, it was heavy, suffocating. The air was cold, a manufactured chill that had nothing to do with the humming air conditioning systems, and everything to do with the 50 pairs of eyes that turned toward me in a single coordinated movement. It was the synchronized motion of a pack of predators detecting a wounded animal in their midst. There were no greetings, no nods of acknowledgement. There were only whispers, insidious and sharp, that slithered through the air like venom. "That's her." To General Thorne's daughter, the one who blew up the Chimera prototype. Each phrase was a tiny poisoned dart. I felt my skin prickle, my posture instinctively stiffen. My training kicked in, spine straight, chin up, eyes forward. But beneath the uniform, I felt naked, pinned like a specimen in a display case. The polished concrete floor gleamed under the recessed lighting, reflecting the judgmental faces that surrounded me. Every step I took, the sharp, solitary click of my regulation heels echoed in the cavernous room. It was the sound of walking on shattered glass. I wasn't here for their pity. I was here to do the job that not a single one of them, for all their whispers, could accomplish. And then I saw him, my father. General Marcus Thorne stood in the center of the room, a monolith of military authority next to the main holoscreen, which pulsed with the angry red warnings of the failing Chimera project. He didn't look at me, not at first. He was performing, and the opening act of his performance was my humiliation. He deliberately let me stand there in the center of the room, marinating in the acid of their collective judgment for exactly 15 seconds. I counted each one. Each second was a lifetime. Then, with a slow, theatrical turn, he faced me. His eyes, the same steely blue as my own, raked over me from head to toe. It wasn't the look of a father. It was the look of a superior officer assessing a broken piece of equipment. A cold, cruel smirk stretched his thin lips. And then he laughed. It was not a sound of amusement. It was a weapon. It was a loud, booming, concussive blast of pure contempt, engineered to detonate in the center of the room and strip me bare in front of every officer, every engineer, every single person who had ever served under my command. The sound ricocheted off the sterile walls, a public declaration of my worthlessness. It was the sound of absolute disdain. When the last echo of his laughter finally died, a horrifying, profound silence descended. He let it hang in the air for a moment before he spoke, his voice a low growl that hammered every word into my soul. "Who allowed this failure in here?" He didn't use my name. He didn't use my rank. He used a noun, failure. He had redefined my entire existence, my 15 years of service, my lifetime of achievements, into a single damning label. His arm shot out, his finger pointing directly at me, a final public gesture of condemnation. Beside him, Chief Engineer Julian Caldwell, his anointed successor, his golden boy, wore a smug, triumphant smirk. He was a willing participant in this execution. He was enjoying the show. In that moment, my world didn't implode because of a technical malfunction or a catastrophic explosion. It collapsed under the weight of 4 words spoken by my own father. The polished floor seemed to tilt beneath my feet. The faces around me blurred into a watercolor wash of scorn and pity. My breath caught in my throat, a knot of grief and rage so tight, I thought I would choke on it. My mind went blank, a white screen of pure, unadulterated shock. I could feel my knees beginning to tremble, threatening to buckle. Just as the darkness at the edge of my vision began to close in, the doors at the far end of the war room hissed open again. A woman stepped through. She was small in stature, dressed in a simple, dark pantsuit, her salt and pepper hair pulled back in a severe bun. But she walked with an undeniable aura of authority that commanded the room's attention more effectively than my father's roar. She was Dr. Helena Vance, and she carried the indisputable power of the Pentagon with her. She didn't pause. She didn't look at anyone else. She walked a straight, unwavering line directly to my father, her gaze as sharp and cold as a surgeon's scalpel. She stopped a foot in front of him, forcing him to look at her. "Actually, General," she said, her voice quiet, but cutting through the tension like a razor. It was as cold as the New Mexico desert at midnight. "I authorized the project's original designer to be here." She held his gaze, her eyes unwavering. "Your incident," she continued, each word delivered with icy precision, "is now my problem, and I don't tolerate circuses." The words hung in the air, a shield of solid steel that had just blocked his final fatal blow. I watched as the crimson rage drained from my father's face, replaced by a pale, chalky humiliation. The monolith had cracked. For the first time all morning, I took a full breath. That laughter, it echoed in the silence that followed Dr. Vance's pronouncement in the war room. It wasn't the first time I'd heard it. That exact sound, the one that held no joy, only a sharp, cutting derision, threw me back 15 years. It was a cruel form of time travel, pulling me from the cold, sterile environment of White Sands and dropping me into the grand, hallowed hall at West Point. I was 17. My hair was longer then, tied back in a simple, no-nonsense ponytail, and my face was free of the lines that stress and chronic disappointment would later carve around my eyes. I was standing on a brightly lit stage, the heavy oak lectern, smelling of lemon polish and a century of speeches. The weight of history was palpable in that room. I had just won first place in the National Science and Engineering Fair for Military Dependents, a competition that brought together the brightest young minds from military families across the country. My project, a miniaturized inertial guidance system I'd built in our garage, was complex, groundbreaking, and, I knew with the fierce certainty of youth, years ahead of its time. It was the culmination of an entire year of sleepless nights, of hands stained with solder and graphite, and 100 meticulously calculated, failed equations. Before I found the single, elegant one that worked, I remember the raw electric thrill that shot through me when they called my name. It was a feeling so pure and powerful, it made my hands tremble as I accepted the award. It was the absolute pride of creation, of wrestling a complex problem to the ground and forcing it to yield its secrets. But then, as a high-ranking officer and a proud father, my own father was invited to the stage to say a few words. And in the span of 2 short minutes, he took my singular, hard-won victory and twisted it into something grotesque. He stood at that historic lectern, his dress blues immaculate, a paradigm of military honor. His voice, trained to command thousands, resonated with practiced authority through the microphone. He began by speaking of the importance of teamwork, of the core values of leadership that West Point itself embodied. His words were smooth and eloquent, and then he gestured towards the audience, his hand pointing to my younger brother Leo, who was sitting in the third row, looking bored. Leo, whose entire contribution to the project had been to half-heartedly help me glue the presentation onto a few poster boards the night before. "Eliza's success today," my father announced, his voice booming with a false sincerity that made my stomach clench, "is a testament to the inspirational leadership of my son Leo. It was Leo who brought the team together and ensured this project was completed on schedule." A wave of polite, then enthusiastic applause erupted through the hall. They were clapping for Leo. They were clapping for a lie, for a beautifully crafted narrative of brotherly teamwork that had never happened. I stood on that stage, clutching a heavy gold-plated trophy, and felt utterly, completely invisible. The physical weight of the award in my hands was nothing compared to the hollow emptiness that opened up in my chest. He hadn't just diminished my work, he had erased me from it. He had stolen it right there in the open and gifted it to his golden boy son. He had taken my mind, my passion, my singular intellectual triumph, and turned it into nothing more than a political tool to polish the future career of the son he truly valued. After the ceremony, Leo came up to me, his face beaming with an unearned, reflected glory. He clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture of casual camaraderie that felt like a slap. "Great job, sis," he said, grinning. "We did it." "We?" The word hung in the air between us, a monument to his ignorance. He didn't even realize the depth of the injustice. He didn't see the theft. He had grown so accustomed to basking in the glow of my efforts, so used to having his path paved with the stones of my hard work, that he simply accepted this as his due. It was his natural state of being. My father had taught him that. I looked into my younger brother's eyes and saw no shame, only the easy, unthinking arrogance of a person who believes they are entitled to the fruits of another's labor. The pain of my father's betrayal was a sharp wound, but to see it reflected and amplified so casually by the brother I loved, that was a different kind of wound, laced with a slow-acting poison. That night, I sat alone in my designated room in the guest barracks. The trophy sat on the cheap laminate desk, its gold finish looking tawdry in the dim light. A quiet knock and the door opened. It was my uncle, my mother's brother, a soft-spoken, brilliant, and perpetually tired-looking senior engineer from NASA. He had driven 6 hours from Maryland just to be there for me. He didn't say much. He didn't offer empty platitudes or criticize my father. He just walked over to the desk where my original, hand-drawn schematics were laid out. He gently placed his large, calloused hand over the intricate lines and calculations, a gesture of profound respect. "They can applaud the story, Eliza," he said, his voice a low, comforting rumble. "Stories can be changed, but this machine, it only obeys the truth. And you are the one who created that truth." He looked up from the papers and met my eyes. "Never forget," he said, leaning in slightly, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "that you're an engine whisperer. You hear things other people can't." His words didn't fix the hurt, but they did something more important. They built a small secret fortress inside my soul. They became a private legacy, a quiet reminder that my real worth wasn't measured in applause or determined by my father's narratives. It was forged in the silent, unyielding truth of metal and logic. It was a truth only the machines, my uncle, and I understood. The fortress my uncle helped me build in my soul. It kept me intact, but it couldn't pay the rent. The truth of metal and logic needed a workshop. It needed a place to become real. After I left the military, I took every dollar I had saved and poured it into a corrugated metal box on the outskirts of Las Cruces, New Mexico. Garage 17. It was my empire of dirt and grease. It baked like an oven in the summer and was bone-chillingly cold in the winter. The air was thick with the smells of motor oil, burnt metal, and the bitter, overbrewed coffee I kept on a hot plate in the corner. I had gone from state-of-the-art, sterile laboratories to this. My new companions were a beat-up set of craftsman tools and a tinny radio that crackled with old country music. I took any job that came my way. I fixed the water pump engines for the local Hatch chili farms. I patched the failing hydraulic systems on rusted-out pickup trucks. I rebuilt generators that were older than I was. It was gritty, dirty, manual labor. It was honest, and it was mine. The men who came to me, at first, all wore the same look, a look of deep, profound skepticism. They'd see this small blonde woman with tired blue eyes and immediately doubt I could possibly understand the complex machinery that was their livelihood. I'll never forget one rancher, a big man with a sunburned neck and a permanent scowl. He threw a set of keys onto my workbench with a loud clatter. "You break it any more than it already is," he grunted, "and I'm not paying you a dime." I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I just nodded, picked up the keys, and got to work. I spent 12 straight hours on his diesel engine, my hands bleeding from a slipped wrench, my face smeared with grease until I looked like a ghost. But when I finally turned the key, the engine didn't just start. It roared to life with a perfect, steady rhythm it probably hadn't had in years. The rancher just stood there, looking from the humming engine to me, then down at my calloused, dirt-caked hands. The look of contempt in his eyes slowly, grudgingly, morphed into a kind of baffled respect. He paid me in cash, didn't say another word, and left. That was a good day. One evening, after a brutal fight with a stubborn transmission, I slumped onto the dusty concrete floor, my back against a stack of old tires. I cracked open a cold Coors Banquet, the champagne of blue-collar work, and checked my emails on my phone. And there it was, an email from Leo. The subject line was just 2 words, "Great news." He was writing to boast. He'd just been promoted to project manager at a major defense contractor. He proudly detailed his latest brilliant initiative for streamlining their supply chain logistics, an idea I recognized instantly because I was the one who had sketched it out for him on a cocktail napkin years ago when he was struggling in business school. I read his words, the bitter taste of the cheap beer mixing with the familiar, acidic taste of injustice in my throat. The world felt so fundamentally crooked in that moment. There he was in an air-conditioned office, getting promotions for selling my old ideas, while I was sitting in the dirt, fighting to make a living with my own 2 hands. I took a long drink of beer, then deleted the email. A familiar wave of hot anger and self-pity washed over me. But this time, something was different. I didn't let it drown me. I stood up, the motion stiff and sore, and channeled that rage into energy. I turned my attention to a passion project I'd been tinkering with, an ancient Cold War-era generator that every other mechanic in the county had declared dead and unsalvageable. I worked through the night, not for money, not for a customer, but for myself. I remembered my uncle's words, "You hear things other people can't." So I listened. I ran my hands over the cold metal casing, feeling the vibrations. I closed my eyes and let the hum of the auxiliary power guide me. After hours, I found it. Not a broken part, but a flaw. A microscopic fracture in an insulation coil, so small that it defied all standard diagnostic tests. As the first pale light of the New Mexico dawn filtered through the grimy windows of my garage, I flipped the main switch. There was a click, a hum, and then a steady, powerful thrum filled the quiet morning air. The generator was alive. Its rhythm was perfect, its power output clean and strong. It was my victory, a silent one with no audience and no applause. But it was real, forged from my own knowledge, my own hands, my own stubborn refusal to give up. And in the silence of that desert sunrise, that was everything I needed. My silent victories in Garage 17 didn't stay silent for long. In the small, interconnected world of high desert mechanics and ranchers, whispers travel faster than dust devils. A reputation for fixing the unfixable is a valuable currency. About a year after I first opened my doors, that reputation paid out in a way I never expected. One morning, while wiping the grease from my hands, I saw a new email pop up on my phone. The sender's address was a jumble of random letters and numbers, heavily encrypted. The message itself was brief, stripped of all pleasantries. "We have a technical problem. We require your consultation. Discretion is absolute. A car will collect you tomorrow at 800. There was no name, no company, no letterhead. My old military instincts screamed that this was not a normal job fixing a tractor. Every part of me that had been trained in caution told me to ignore it. But the engineer in me, the part that lived for a challenge, was intensely curious. That part won. I replied with a single word: confirmed. The next morning, exactly at 8 o'clock, a black, unmarked SUV with tinted windows pulled up in front of my garage, its engine barely making a sound. It was the kind of vehicle that screamed federal government or private military contractor. It drove me deep into the Chihuahuan desert, to a location that looked, from the outside, like a derelict cattle ranch. But the high-tech surveillance cameras tucked into the eaves of the barn told a different story. The woman who greeted me was petite, with salt and pepper hair pulled back into a severe, tidy bun. She wore a simple but impeccably tailored business suit that seemed out of place in the dusty landscape. But it was her eyes that held my attention. They were sharp, intelligent, and radiated an invisible, unassailable authority. "Helena," she said, extending a hand. Her handshake was firm, her focus absolute. She wasted no time on small talk, leading me directly past the rustic facade and into a state-of-the-art laboratory. There, mounted on a testing cradle, was an engine prototype that made my breath catch. I recognized its architecture immediately, an advanced iteration of an old DARPA design. "Everyone says it's dead," Helena said, her voice calm and even. "They've tried everything. What do you think?" I spent the next 2 days in that lab. I barely ate. I didn't sleep. It was just me and the machine. I didn't just read the terabytes of diagnostic data they had compiled. That was their mistake. They were looking at the data, but they weren't listening to the engine. I placed my hands on its cold metal casing, closed my eyes, and just listened. I felt the vibrations, the subtle harmonics, and I heard it. A tiny stutter in the fuel injection cycle, a microsecond anomaly so minute that the automated diagnostic systems had dismissed it as within acceptable tolerance. It wasn't broken, it was out of tune. I spent hours sketching out a new control schematic, proposing a software patch to recalibrate the controller logic. When I was ready, I presented my findings to Helena. She sat across the table from me, and as I explained my reasoning, she never once interrupted. She just listened, her sharp, perceptive gaze seeming to see right through my technical jargon and into the core of my thinking. When I finished, she was silent for a moment. "You're not just a mechanic," she said finally, a statement of fact. "You're having a conversation with it." It was the first time anyone had truly understood my process. "Ms. Keaton," Helena continued, and the use of my formal surname felt like a knighting. "3 years ago, the Pentagon lost a valuable asset. I've read the official report on the Chimera prototype explosion. I've also read your original, unedited design schematics. They don't match." My heart hammered against my ribs. It felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. She knew. "Your talent," she said, her voice softening almost imperceptibly as she slid a thick consultant's contract across the table, "deserves to be compensated, not buried. It should be honored, not taken for granted." Her words landed like a balm on a wound I didn't even know was still open. She leaned forward. "The Chimera project is failing. I need you to come back, not as a general's daughter, not as a scapegoat, but as the best damn engineer I know." And in that sterile, quiet lab, I started to cry. For the first time in years, tears streamed down my face. But they weren't tears of pain or humiliation. They were tears of gratitude, of profound, overwhelming relief. Have you ever had a moment like that? A moment where a stranger sees you more clearly than your own family ever has? This woman, this stranger, had just given me the one thing my own blood had always denied me: their trust. Stepping back onto the grounds of White Sands felt like walking into a ghost story where I was the ghost. The news of my return, under Dr. Vance's direct authority, had spread like a seismic shockwave through the facility's tightly knit community. My father couldn't publicly oppose a decision that came down from the Pentagon, but he was a master of asymmetrical warfare. He made sure I felt the chill of his displeasure in other ways, sending a clear, unspoken message through the ranks. I was not welcome. The first technical briefing was his opening salvo. I was there as a consultant, but I was also the original architect of the system they were failing to fix, a fact that hung in the air like unspoken static. I started to explain my initial diagnostic theory, outlining the subtle frequency modulation I had detected at the private lab. I hadn't even finished my first sentence before I was cut off by Julian Caldwell, my father's freshly polished crown prince. "With all due respect, Ms. Keaton," he said, the condescending emphasis on Miss a deliberate jab. "A public stripping of my former rank." He smirked, playing to his audience. "Your Jamame intuitive methods might work on old farm tractors out in the sticks, but here we operate on hard data and established protocols. The data doesn't support your feeling." He said it in front of the entire engineering team, a blatant, pre-rehearsed attempt to discredit me before I could even begin. The room fell silent, every engineer suddenly fascinated by their notepads, everyone watching the power play unfold. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't let the hot flash of anger show on my face. I just held his gaze until he started to look uncomfortable, his smugness flickering. "The data isn't lying, Caldwell," I said, my voice low and steady, carrying across the quiet room. "The problem is you're not asking it the right questions. You're looking for a broken part when you should be listening for a discordant note." That evening, in the sterile quiet of my temporary quarters, my phone rang. The caller ID was a blocked number, but I knew who it was. It was my father's private line. His voice, when I answered, was no longer the thunderous roar from the war room. It had been replaced by something far more insidious, the calm, rational, and deeply patronizing tone of fatherly advice. "Eliza, I hear you're causing some friction with Caldwell's team," he began, the words smooth as silk, a verbal pat on the head. "You're digging up things that were settled 3 years ago. It's counterproductive. You need to remember your place. You're just a consultant here, an outside voice. Let the team do their work." A cold knot formed in my stomach. He was defining my boundaries, putting me in a box. "My place," I replied, my voice as cold as the steel casing on the Chimera engine, "is as the person who designed this system from the ground up. And I know it was altered." There was a brief, telling pause on the other end of the line. When he spoke again, the silk was gone, replaced by unyielding steel. "I refined it," he said, his voice hard and final. "Your original design was too ambitious, too risky. I made it safer. I made it more practical. Don't make this situation worse for everyone with your professional arrogance." It was a masterful piece of gaslighting. In his version of history, he wasn't a saboteur, he was a protector. I wasn't a truth seeker. I was an arrogant child who didn't know what was good for her. I had barely processed the depth of his delusion when my phone rang again, almost immediately after I hung up. This time it was my mother. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't ask if I was okay. She simply launched into a performance of preemptive hysterical tears. "Eliza, what are you doing?" she sobbed into the phone, her voice thick with manufactured panic. "Your father is under so much stress, his entire career, the family's honor. How can you threaten to destroy everything because of your own selfishness? You need to think about your brother, about his future. Please, for the love of God, just take a step back." Her words were like a volley of poison-tipped needles, each one aimed at a place she knew was vulnerable. She had twisted my fight for professional integrity into an act of personal selfishness. She weaponized family honor, a concept that had never once been used to defend me, to demand my silence. In that moment, I realized with sickening clarity that her quiet, complicit silence over the years was 1,000 times more damaging than my father's overt cruelty. He was the storm, but she was the toxic, stagnant air that allowed the mold to grow. She was the chief enabler. Something inside me, a wire that had been stretched taut for 3 decades, finally snapped. "Mom," I said, and my own voice startled me. It wasn't trembling, it wasn't pleading, it was terrifyingly steady, devoid of all heat. The family's honor was destroyed 3 years ago when not a single person in it stood up for the truth. "Eliza, don't you dare take that tone with me." "I will not," I cut her off, the words clean and sharp. "Take a step back, not this time." I ended the call. My hand, when I looked down at it, was shaking. But it wasn't from fear or weakness. It was from a rage so pure and white-hot, it felt like it could melt steel. The dull, persistent ache of past injustices had finally ignited into a blazing, clarifying fire. I knew then, with absolute certainty, that I couldn't rely on my memory or my intuition. My word against a general's was nothing. I needed proof. I needed cold, hard, undeniable evidence. The kind of evidence that would show the world Dr. Vance and my own fractured self exactly what they had done. The real war had just begun. The anger didn't fade after the calls. It cooled. It solidified into a cold, hard, and terrifyingly clear purpose. That night, sleep was an impossibility. The ghost of my mother's pleas and my father's lies weren't just echoes in my head anymore. They were the fuel for a hunt. I sat in front of my secure terminal in the pre-dawn darkness, the clinical green glow of the screen illuminating my face. In that moment, I shed the skin of the consultant, of the daughter, of the victim. I was an investigator. I was a soldier on a mission, and the objective was the truth. I decided right then that I was done waiting for permission. I was done playing by their carefully constructed rules. Drawing on old, deeply buried skills from my time in technical intelligence, I began to probe the base's internal network. I slipped past the standard user-level security protocols, not with a battering ram, but with a series of quiet, precise maneuvers that mimicked the authorized access of a low-level systems administrator. I wasn't looking for top-secret classified files. That would have triggered every alarm from here to the NSA. I was hunting in the digital boneyard. I was searching the long-term archives, the auxiliary maintenance logs, the temporary data caches, the forgotten dusty corners of the system that no one ever thinks to sanitize. I moved through the labyrinthine directory trees like a lone wolf stalking through a silent, digital forest. I didn't know exactly what my prey looked like, but I could smell its trail of deceit. After hours of methodical, painstaking searching, my heart hammering against my ribs, with a frantic mixture of fear and adrenaline, I found it. It was buried deep, nested within a subfolder, so obscurely labeled it was practically invisible. Temporary calibration reports out of Archive Q3. Inside was a detailed log of the changes made to the Chimera's emergency alert system. My original design, a 6-stage waterfall protocol that provided nuanced cascading warnings to allow for intervention, had been stripped out. It was replaced by a brutally simple, all-or-nothing, 2-stage protocol. But it was the authorization signature at the bottom of the log that made the blood freeze in my veins. It wasn't a committee, it wasn't an engineering panel. It was a single administrative override, executed by General Marcus Thorne. His digital signature was there, stark and undeniable, next to a timestamp, Idobo 2:13 a.m., just 24 hours before the prototype exploded. He had done it himself, in the dead of night, alone. My hand flew to my mouth to stifle a gasp that felt torn from my lungs. This wasn't negligence. This wasn't an error in judgment made under pressure. This was deliberate sabotage. But that wasn't the worst of it. The horrifying discovery only fueled my desperate search. The rage gave me a focus I hadn't felt in years. I kept digging, my fingers flying across the keyboard, chasing down every fragmented data packet linked to that timestamp. And then I found the document that shattered the last vestiges of my denial. It was a scanned image of my own hand-drawn schematic for the thrust vectoring valve placement, a key component whose failure had been the linchpin of the explosion. But attached to the digital file was a scanned, handwritten note on official letterhead. The handwriting was his, the sharp, angular script I knew as well as my own. Positioning altered per recommendation of Chief Engineer Caldwell to increase initial launch efficiency, MT. Those were his initials, Marcus Thorne. It was a lie, a calculated, despicable, fabricated lie. Caldwell would never have made such a technically unsound recommendation. It violated basic principles of fluid dynamics. My father hadn't just approved a fatal change, he had manufactured a false paper trail to justify it, preemptively placing the blame on his own protege to cover his tracks and create a clean narrative. He had built my professional coffin and signed another man's name on it. That was the moment everything inside me broke. The years of quiet pain, of being overlooked, of being gaslit, all of it coalesced into a single, blinding point of cold, diamond-hard fury. This wasn't just about a career. He had been willing to let me take the fall for a catastrophe he personally engineered. As I stared at the screen, my breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps, I found one last item. A simple search through the public base archives brought up a social bulletin from the Fort Bliss Officers Club, dated the day after I was forced to resign. It announced a celebratory cocktail party hosted by General Marcus Thorne in honor of the successful and efficient restructuring of the Chimera project. He had thrown a party, he had raised a glass and toasted with scotch on the ashes of my career and reputation. I felt like I was standing alone and naked in the middle of a vast, silent arena, the jeering crowd invisible but deafening. And then, in a moment of pure, strange serendipity, the old radio I kept in the corner for company crackled to life. A late-night public radio show was replaying a speech. I recognized the voice immediately. It was Brené Brown. It is not the critic who counts. Her calm, steady voice filled the silent room. Not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly. I closed my eyes, the words washing over me, a balm on a raw wound. Yes, I was in the arena, and I had been struck down. I had failed, but I would not stay on the ground, not anymore. With a newfound chilling clarity, I stood up. I systematically copied every file, the logs, the altered schematic, the handwritten note, the party invitation, onto a heavily encrypted flash drive. It felt heavy in my hand, not with the weight of data, but with the weight of truth. I looked at my own ghostly reflection on the dark monitor. My face was pale, my eyes burning with a righteous fire. "You chose the wrong arena, General," I whispered to the reflection, a vow made to myself in the darkness. "And now you're going to have to face the gladiator you created." The sun rose over the jagged peaks of the Organ Mountains, but I hadn't slept. I didn't feel tired. The white-hot rage from the night before had been through a forge. It had been hammered and quenched, emerging as something new, a cold, sharp, singular purpose. I was no longer a victim caught in a storm of my father's making. I was a prosecutor, and the sun was rising on the first day of the trial I was about to convene. The encrypted flash drive in my pocket felt heavy, not with the minuscule weight of its plastic and silicon, but with the profound weight of truth. The warrior my father had unknowingly created over decades of relentless pressure was now armed, and every warrior, every soldier, every prosecutor needs a battle plan. I spent the entire morning in the sterile temporary office they had assigned me, a box of a room that felt more like an interrogation cell. With the flash drive connected to my secure laptop, I worked with the methodical precision of a bomb disposal expert, arranging the files I had downloaded into an unassailable logical structure. I wasn't just compiling evidence, I was building a case, piece by damning piece. Each log file, each timestamp, each unauthorized digital signature, and each cloying manipulative email was labeled, cross-referenced, and placed into a chronological timeline of deceit. My presentation would not be an emotional appeal. It would be an engineering inquest. I was constructing my argument not with legal statutes, which could be twisted, but with pure, irrefutable engineering logic. A machine, unlike a man, doesn't lie. And I was going to let the ghost of the Chimera tell its own unvarnished story. Around noon, when the desert sun was at its most punishing, there was a soft, hesitant knock on my door. It was David Chen, the young data analyst from Caldwell's team. He was a quiet, almost invisible presence in meetings, a man who always seemed to be studying the scuffs on his shoes, as if hoping to find a trap door in the floor. He looked terrified now, his eyes darting towards the hallway, as if expecting my father or Caldwell to materialize at any moment. "Major Keaton," he whispered, his voice barely audible. He still used my old rank, a small unconscious sign of respect that felt strangely significant. I know what happened 3 years ago. I was the junior analyst who ran the initial data sweeps right after the incident. I saw the original diagnostic logs before they were archived. He meant wiped clean, erased from the official record. I didn't say anything. I was scared. I have a family, a mortgage. His confession was a cascade of quiet panic. He quickly, almost furtively, held out a small, nondescript USB drive. "This is my personal backup of the original, unedited, automated logging sequence from the day of the explosion. The one that was deleted. I kept it. I don't know why. I felt like it was wrong. I think you should have it." I looked at him, at his pale, frightened face, and saw the war between his conscience and his fear. His belated courage didn't erase 3 years of cowardly silence, but it did give me the final critical piece of my arsenal. It gave me the before to my after. I nodded slowly, taking the drive from his trembling hand. Its plastic casing was warm. "Thank you, Chen," I said, my voice even and calm, trying to offer him a sliver of the reassurance he so desperately needed. "You did the right thing?" He gave a jerky, grateful nod and practically fled from my office. Now I had it all, the original truth and the fabricated lie. But I knew that presenting a folder of digital files in a closed-door meeting wasn't enough. In a world of politics and power, data could be dismissed as interpretation, as a difference of professional opinion. I needed more than evidence. I needed a demonstration of power. I had to show them, not just tell them. I found an empty briefing room down the hall, one with a massive, wall-sized whiteboard, untouched and gleaming under the fluorescent lights. I picked up a black dry erase marker, the cap making a sharp, definitive click as I removed it, and I began to draw. From memory, with a hand that did not shake, I recreated the entire original design of the Chimera project. The intricate coolant circulation loops, the precise calibration of the pressurization valves, the elegant logic of my 6-stage cascading warning system. Every line was exact, every parameter flawless. The black ink flowed from the marker, my hand moving with a speed and certainty that felt almost otherworldly, a direct conduit from my mind to the board. It wasn't just a technical drawing, it was a declaration. It was an act of intellectual and spiritual resurrection. I was bringing a murdered design back to life, right there in the open for all to see. I was showing them the beauty, the complexity, and the inherent safety they had willfully destroyed. As I was finishing the final subsystem, a shadow fell over the board. Julian Caldwell stood in the open doorway, arms crossed, a condescending sneer plastered on his face. He looked from the sprawling, intricate schematic to me, my hand still moving. "Still playing with your drawings, Keaton?" he mocked, his voice dripping with disdain. "It's cute. Maybe you should go back to fixing those tractors. This is the big leagues." I didn't turn around. I didn't grant him a single glance. I just kept drawing, adding one last, crucial detail to the schematic. My signature in the bottom right-hand corner. Clear, proud, and unwavering. Eliza M. Keaton. The whiteboard was no longer a simple tool for work. It had become a gauntlet thrown down, a silent public accusation that was more powerful than any shouted argument. I didn't have to say a word. My work, the pure, undiluted truth of it, spoke for itself in a language of elegant, undeniable logic, and I knew, with every fiber of my being, they would have to answer it. The whiteboard became a silent accusation in the middle of the engineering bay. It was too big, too detailed, and too public to be ignored. It was a masterpiece of passive aggression, and it worked. Dr. Vance saw it on her morning tour, and after a private 10-minute meeting with me, where I presented her with my encrypted drive, an emergency simulation review was on the schedule for that afternoon. My father couldn't refuse a direct order from his civilian oversight, but he was a brilliant tactician, and he immediately turned the situation into what he thought was an inescapable trap for me. He framed it not as an inquiry into a potential flaw, but as a demonstration of the project's resilience. With blinding arrogance, he invited a small, hand-picked group of influential defense journalists to observe a routine calibration test. His goal was twofold: to witness my public failure under the glare of the media, and to solidify his narrative that the project, under his refined guidance, was firmly under control. When I walked into the simulation room that afternoon, it felt less like a technical review and more like a public execution. The air was thick with tension. The engineers from Caldwell's team stood stiffly at their stations, avoiding my eyes. The journalists, with their notebooks and cameras, stood along the back wall, their faces a mixture of curiosity and predatory anticipation. And in the center of it all, like Roman emperors about to preside over the games, stood General Marcus Thorne and his protégé, Julian Caldwell. They were radiating a confidence that bordered on smugness. This was their stage. They thought this was my final act. At a nod from my father, the simulation began. "Run the current configuration," he commanded, his voice full of authority. The lead engineer initiated the sequence, my father's compromised sequence. On the main holoscreen, the 3D model of the Chimera engine roared to virtual life. The numbers on the telemetry displays began to climb. For a moment, it looked stable. Then the amber warnings started to flicker. The numbers turned red. The engine sound in the simulation deepened into a tortured groan. And then, exactly at the 92-second mark, the screen flashed with a massive crimson alert: critical failure, rotor imbalance, catastrophic event imminent. Caldwell, performing his part perfectly, slammed a hand down on the emergency stop button. The simulation froze. He turned to the journalists, his face a mask of weary competence. "As you can see, ladies and gentlemen," he explained smoothly, "we are dealing with a system that has certain inherent instabilities in its original design architecture. We are working diligently to mitigate them." He was blaming me, publicly. My father nodded gravely, a look of solemn approval on his face. The lie was being cemented into the official record. It was then that Dr. Vance spoke, her calm, quiet voice cutting through the manufactured drama like a laser. "Thank you, Mr. Caldwell. Now," she said, turning her gaze to the lead engineer, "we will run the simulation again, this time using Major Keaton's original configuration." My rank. She had used my rank. A jolt went through me. Caldwell smirked, taking the encrypted drive I held out to him. He plugged it into the master console, leaning in as he did so. "Let's see your ghost dance," he whispered, just loud enough for me to hear. The simulation began again. This time, the initial reaction was even more violent. The system, accustomed to the safer parameters, bucked like an untamed horse. Alarms shrieked through the room. Red lights flashed across every console. The journalists began murmuring, exchanging knowing glances. Caldwell shot me a look of pure, triumphant victory. This was the failure he and my father had counted on, but I was calm. The chaos on the screen was exactly what I had predicted. The system was fighting the change. "Pause simulation," I commanded, my voice clear and steady. The room froze. I walked past Caldwell, not even glancing at him, and stood before the main control interface. With a series of swift, precise movements, I manually overrode and recalibrated 3 core parameters: the fuel mixture variance, the coolant flow rate, and the harmonic feedback loop. I didn't look at the data streams on the screen. I didn't need to. I closed my eyes for a split second, feeling the engine's rhythm in my mind, listening to its language. I was the engine whisperer. "Continue simulation," I said. The entire room held its breath. As the program resumed, something miraculous happened. The piercing shriek of the alarms began to subside, one by one. The frantic flashing red lights turned to a steady amber, and then, one after another, they blinked into a calm, reassuring green. The deep, tortured groan of the engine smoothed out into a powerful, clean, and perfectly balanced hum. The simulation clock ticked past the fatal 92-second mark. It passed 120 seconds, 180, 240. It completed the entire 300-second full power cycle without a single error, a single flicker of instability. It performed flawlessly, exceeding the original efficiency projections by 7%. The only sound in the vast, silent room was the steady, powerful hum of the simulated engine. No one spoke. No one moved. I saw the journalists slowly lower their cameras, their expressions a mixture of shock and dawning realization. They turned their lenses away from the screen and focused them on the faces of the 2 men in the center of the room. Caldwell stood frozen, his mouth slightly agape, the color drained from his face. He looked like he had seen a ghost. And my father, General Marcus Thorne, stood as still as a statue, his face a horrifying mask of disbelief and rage. The Emperor suddenly found himself naked in the arena. All of his power, all of his authority, all of his carefully constructed lies had just evaporated, consumed by the perfect, silent hum of the machine he had tried and failed to kill. The silence in this simulation room had been louder than any explosion. It was the sound of a paradigm shifting, of a career ending. The aftermath was swift and brutal. The defense journalists who had been invited to witness my execution instead reported on a political coup orchestrated with elegant, undeniable engineering. The story created a media firestorm. Within days, the Pentagon launched a formal investigation. General Marcus Thorne was suspended from duty, pending a full review. Julian Caldwell was fired immediately for gross incompetence and professional misconduct. The entire empire my father had built over a 40-year career, an empire of fear, loyalty, and absolute control, was crumbling like a sandcastle against the tide. I didn't feel the elation I thought I would. There was no triumphant fist pump, no celebratory drink. There was only a vast, hollow emptiness, like the ringing in your ears after a great battle. The war was over. The truth had won, but I just felt tired. A few days later, my phone rang. It was Leo. For a foolish, hopeful second, I thought he might be calling to ask if I was okay, to ask what had really happened. I thought for a moment that he might finally be ready to listen. I was wrong. "What the hell did you do?" he screamed into the phone, his voice cracking with rage and panic. "You ruined him. You ruined Dad. You destroyed everything, all for your stupid, selfish ego. Do you have any idea how this is going to affect my career? My connections? They're all tied to him, you selfish bitch." I stood there, phone pressed to my ear, and listened to his tirade without saying a word. I listened as he accused me, insulted me, and blamed me for the consequences of our father's own actions. He saw none of the original sin, only the fallout that was inconveniencing him. When he finally ran out of breath, his heaving pants echoing down the line, I spoke. My voice was eerily calm. "You never once asked how I felt, did you, Leo?" I said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "Not 3 years ago, not now, goodbye." I ended the call and blocked his number. With that simple, final action, the last frayed thread connecting me to the illusion of family was severed. It didn't even hurt. It was just quiet. The final confrontation came a few days after that. I was back at my garage in Las Cruces, covered in grease from a stubborn Ford F-150 transmission, when his sedan pulled up in a cloud of dust. He got out. He wasn't wearing his uniform. Dressed in civilian clothes, he looked smaller, older. The towering monolith of a man I had known my whole life was gone, replaced by a stooped, gray-faced old man who looked like he had aged a decade in a week. He didn't apologize. He didn't even try. He started to explain, to rationalize, his voice raspy. "I just wanted to protect you, Eliza. The design was too risky. I never thought it would go this far." The same old lies, the same tired narrative. I held up a hand, my palm stained with oil. He stopped, surprised by the authority in the gesture. "Don't," I said, my voice quiet but unyielding. "Don't insult my intelligence anymore. You didn't do it to protect me. You did it to protect yourself, to protect your legacy, to protect your control." He opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. He fell silent because he knew I was right. There was nothing left to say. Slowly, I wiped my right hand on a rag, and then I twisted the heavy gold ring on my finger. My West Point ring. The one he had placed on my hand at my graduation ceremony, a symbol of everything he represented. Tradition, honor, a legacy of command, and a legacy of absolute, suffocating imposition. It was the last chain that bound me to his world. I pulled it off. The skin underneath was pale and indented. I stepped forward and placed the ring into his open, waiting palm. It looked small and insignificant in his hand. "I'm giving this back to you," I said, my voice steady and clear, free of anger or malice. "I don't need your legacy. I'm going to build my own, from the pieces you tried to break. My legacy will be the truth." I didn't wait for a response. I turned my back on him, walked into my garage, and pulled the heavy roll-up door down. It shut with a loud, final clang, leaving him alone in the desert dust. For the first time in my 37 years of life, I felt completely, utterly, and breathtakingly free. A year passed. Freedom, I discovered, wasn't a sudden explosion of joy. It was a quiet, vast emptiness. For the first time, there were no expectations to meet, no battles to fight, no ghosts to prove wrong. The silence that followed was daunting at first, and I had to learn, for the first time, how to fill it with my own voice. Garage 17 is no longer a solitary refuge. I bought the adjacent bay, knocked down the wall, and expanded. It's no longer just my workshop. It's the home of the Uncle David Project, a nonprofit tuition-free technical school for female veterans. Every morning now, the space is filled not with lonely silence, but with laughter, the clang of metal on metal, and the rich smell of freshly brewed coffee. I don't teach from textbooks. I teach my students to listen, to feel, to trust their hands and their intuition. I teach them that their value isn't on a medal or a rank they left behind, but in their innate ability to create, to repair, and to understand. A few months ago, a thick manila envelope arrived with the official seal of the Department of the Navy. Inside was a handwritten letter from Dr. Vance. She informed me that the investigation had concluded, that my rank of major had been fully reinstated with all back pay and benefits. She included a formal offer to return, to lead a new, independent R&D division. "The Navy needs people like you, Eliza," she wrote, "people with the courage to speak truth to power." I read the letter, a warm smile spreading across my face. Then I folded it carefully and placed it in an old wooden box where I keep my uncle's few belongings. The validation was important. It was the official closing of a painful chapter, but it no longer defined me. This afternoon, I walked over to a young Marine veteran who was struggling with a complex transmission assembly. Her shoulders slumped in frustration. I didn't say anything. I just reached into my uncle's old toolbox and pulled out a small, worn-down wrench, its wooden handle smooth from years of his use. "My uncle used to say that a good engineer doesn't force a machine," I said softly, my voice just for her. "They persuade it. Try listening. Ask it what it needs." I placed the old wrench in her hand. Her eyes, which had been cloudy with frustration, suddenly lit up with a new understanding. She looked from the wrench to me and back to the engine. In that small, quiet moment, I knew what my legacy was. It wasn't the Chimera project, it was this passing of knowledge, this continuation. As the day ends and the last of the students head home, I sit on the old metal stool at the front of my garage, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The New Mexico sky is on fire, bleeding from burnt orange into a deep, bruised purple. A year ago, this solitude would have felt like loneliness. Now it feels like peace. The silence is no longer an emptiness to be feared, but a space to be filled with contentment. I walked through fire, and I was not consumed. I took the ashes of my past and built a new foundation. I am Eliza Keaton, an engineer, a teacher, a survivor. And finally, I am free. The desert wind whispers around the open doors of the garage, and for the first time, it doesn't sound like a lonely cry. It sounds like a symphony. My own. Finding my own symphony wasn't easy. It took walking through fire, facing down ghosts I thought would haunt me forever, and learning that my worth was never up for debate. I know that many of you listening right now have stood in your own arenas, with your own critics, feeling your own silence. The most important thing I learned is that your story, your truth, has its own undeniable power. Don't ever let anyone else write it for you. If stories of resilience and finding your own truth resonate with you, I invite you to subscribe to Chosen Revenge and share your own moment of strength in the comments below. Because every voice, especially yours, deserves to be heard.